Okay, hello and welcome. Welcome back to Breaking Boundaries podcast. So we are extremely lucky this week. We have Cal with us as one portion of the infamous Muscle Mentors. If you don't know, or if you don't already follow Cal, not only is he an athlete and a competitor himself, he's actually one of the most successful physique coaches in the UK with athletes. The athletes that are coming out at the minute, you've got like Josh, Erin, Joe, Brandon, so pretty full house. But obviously your success is down to a lot of experience and a lot of knowledge, which you give out to a lot of people as well through so many platforms. But yeah, just to start off, I guess after that little intro, how are you today? How are you doing?
I've got a lot to live up to now.
Well, I thought, you deserve a little gas. So there you go.
Yeah, everything's good. It's been show season's underway, so it's been a busy few weeks. We got back from Portugal last week with Josh, who narrowly missed out on that overall by a point. We got the scorecard back and it was 1 point. So he's actually in Spain now. We're doing the Alicante show on Sunday.
I have been keeping up to date. It has been, everyone I think has been on the edge.
There's the chef. Thanks, mate.
Can I have one, please?
Yeah. So yeah, he's in Spain now, and then obviously the two bros this weekend, and it's all kicking off, which is exciting. So it's been good. It's just nice to have something going on again instead of a year of just waiting for something to happen, right?
Yeah, I think we're all extremely excited about this season. Like, even if we're not competing ourselves, I am actually currently in prep, but you're completely in an off season, aren't you, Oz?
I'm not competing for like 2 years now, so it's nice to kind of have like a bit of momentum of seeing other people compete to like kind of keep me going and get me excited, which is nice. It's good fun.
I think that's something in itself. I presume Loz is kind of having some time to put tissue on in the first place, but that's something in itself to talk about in terms of time away from stage and how long it actually takes to build a physique.
Yeah, definitely. And I think to kind of start off, we may as well get started with talking about that post-show phase, because I honestly still feel like I'm in that post-show phase because I'm still like regaining a regular menstrual cycle and regaining my hormones. And I kind of want to understand what your approach is to that, like particularly for females and natural females, like how you go about that post-show phase and how you approach like making sure that their hormones are back in check and their health is like the main priority after that diet phase.
Yeah, so like the best way of describing that is the menstrual cycle in general and female physiology. A lot of the systems that are in play there, it's a high cost process from a metabolic perspective. So you can see, like, if you view that as currency, then holding on to the ovarian cycle in a prep is expensive. It's going to require a lot of energy to sustain that, and when the body's put under a lot of stress, whether that's physiological, physically, through a calorie deficit, high output, hard training, all of that compacts on top of one another, and we eventually start to get a situation where we're seeing this hypothalamic amenorrhea. So we're seeing suppression with the gonadotropin hormones FSH and LH, and the cycle reflects that. Yeah. The biggest consideration for us coming out of prep is to start unloading that stress, and also from the standpoint of a female competitor and a male as well. But we'll all know that part of that is the psychological turmoil of coming out of prep, and part of that is the physical turmoil of coming out of prep. And obviously there's a tapering in terms of output and them slowly pulling out of a calorie deficit. And as we start to kind of peel away those layers of where they dug themselves in prep, we're going to have to gradually climb out of that hole, right? Yeah. I think one of the biggest considerations for that post-show phase is the fact that the longer we extend that window of them struggling, the more prolonged that deficit is going to be, and the more prolonged the ovarian cycle is going to be lost for. So a simple rule that I'll always use is the first adjustment that I'll make coming out of prep will put them in a comfortable, quote unquote, comfortable position. So it will be a more aggressive jump to start with in terms of calories, or a more aggressive reduction in cardio. And then I'll move slowly from there, as opposed to that whole concept of like the reverse diet where it's probably worse than the prep it was itself, because there's not the show in front of you to actually remain focused on. Like I personally found like reverse dieting a client, particularly psychologically, is even harder than prep.
Yeah, I agree. Do you ever find though that females sometimes struggle with a sudden increase in their food after dieting for so long and kind of seeing that initial weight gain? Do you find that there's certain like methods that you have to take with females to make sure that they can mentally handle that phase as well?
Yeah, like there's going to be a lot of individuality in terms of you understanding the client's psychology through the prep itself, and then having a gauge of how aggressive you can and realistically should be coming out of the other side. Now, the end goal is still the same for all those clients, but for some of those clients, you might need to micromanage at a slightly slower rate, because you know that they're going to have a more difficult time pushing back out. And, you know, whether that's body image wise, whether that's them, you know, getting used to eating more food again, you know, avoiding those triggers, all that stuff starts to come into play. And it's just a case of you're eventually going to move in the same direction. It's just the speed in which you're moving there in.
Yeah. So would you say then from that you would take a different approach, just athlete to athlete, or do you think that females and male athletes are like completely different coming out of a prep?
I think if we're talking the unenhanced realms, male athletes will generally have a better resilience at regaining control of their health from a quicker degree. Yeah. Whereas a female athlete, it's going to be a more fragile process then getting back to what we'd refer to as like homeostasis, if that makes sense. And like you look at, you know, from an unassisted athlete, there are two axes that are going to be influenced there. For a female, the hypothalamus pituitary and the ovarian axis, and that thyroidal axis as well. And the thyroidal axis is the axis that's going to come back pretty quick when we start pulling your food back up. Yeah. But the ovarian axis is the one that's going to take some time. Yeah. And just generally speaking, I think males will probably bounce back a little bit quicker. And 9 times out of 10, they're probably going to place less stress on themselves of going through that process in the first place, because generally speaking, and that's definitely not saying, you know, definitively, but generally speaking, the emotional attachment through the back end of prep is an easier process to get through for most guys. Whereas for a lot of females, it can be a really arduous time. Yeah. And one thing we've got to appreciate is the fact that the nervous system and stress in general is the biggest component of them regaining control of their health. So the psychological stress from a post-show phase is just as problematic as physical stress, you know?
Yeah. And do you think that plays like quite a big part as well in the amount of time that it actually takes a female to recover? Because you see a lot of females who've literally like been in an off season, or like their show finished like 6 months ago and they're going straight back into a prep. But, you know, it can take 6 months or longer, to be honest, to recover. And do you think that a lot of that sometimes is psychological more than actually like physiological as well?
I think it's both, but the psychological element, when they are having a difficult time, definitely has a big impact on them getting back to a good baseline, because stress is stress, and stress impacting the nervous system will impact other organs and other you know, departments down below. So if they've had a rough time getting back to where they need to be psychologically, then that's going to extend the period of time they're going to get to, you know, be in a position where we'd even consider another dieting phase. You know, a lot of these situations where it's like, right, I finished prep in the end of October at the British final, and then I'm starting prep again in April. Yeah. It's probably going to take them 3 months before they're even in a position where they're back to normal again, and then they're starting prep in 4 weeks' time. Yeah. So you can't build any muscle there, let alone, you know, get your health back to a good place.
Yeah, that was honestly what I was just about to ask. Like, what do you think is, I'm guessing it's person dependent, but what do you think is the optimal amount of time, like between seasons? Do you think that it's smart for people to literally flick between shows? Or do you think it's even dependent on whether they're pro or not? Because I guess if you're an amateur, then you are going to take that time away from stage, because I know for me personally, I'm in no place where I can just hop season to season, because I know that I still have so much to grow. So
yeah, I think if you are, you know, there are probably 2 situations where that would be apparent. If it was somebody that had already gained pro status, that was in the realms of muscularity for being competitive already, then, you know, realistically we could probably stop and start a little bit there. or if it was someone knocking on the door of going from amateur to elite, and they're in a position where they hold the muscle to probably qualify for going to the next step, but they're in a position where, right, they might have a crack at the whip at the start of the year, then they might push back up for 4 months, and then they're going to come back down towards the end of the year. The only way that I see that possible, though, is the fact that when you stop that dieting phase, they're going to have to push up fairly quick. They can't spend their time creeping up. It's going to have to be a case of, I'm in prep now, and then I need my food high because I've only got 3, 4, 5 months until I'm actually going to start dieting again. And I can't spend the 6 to 8 weeks that, I could have done gradually creeping back up.
Yeah. Do you think that the ability to do that as well, like, differs massively between whether you're assisted or non-assisted as well?
Yeah, because when you're looking at enhanced athletes, you are deliberately using hormones to basically replace the hormones that are being suppressed within those two axes. So like, if an enhanced athlete gets the blood work done and they've got, low T4 and T3 in prep, then it's like, why we just use replacement T4 and T3? Like, you can just add that in and it's just stable then. Or, an enhanced athlete, a female client looking to retain tissue, well, we're just going to add in something that allows you to retain tissue. And you can do that in a very safe manner if you know how to deploy those things. Even the likes of you can use other tools that commonly you'd see used from a fat loss perspective, so like Clenbuterol, for example, like that has the ability to induce mTOR phosphorylation, which is retentive for lean muscles. So all these girls that will be using these aids, they're actually helping them maintain more lean mass through prep as well. Yeah. You're going to definitely have more control if you have access to those tools. And I think from a natural athlete's perspective, if you've really got in shape and you've pushed condition, especially as a figure athlete, even a bikini girl getting really, really lean, it's going to take a long time for their body to recover. And it's going to take a long time for their mind to recover unless they're a seasoned athlete that's done this over and over and over again.
Yeah, completely. Because I did my first show last year, and I'm now 8 months, I think, into my off season. But I tried to do a diet in March and my body just did not respond well at all. And I've had my bloods done recently, and my T3 levels are just still not back to normal. So it just shows that I just need so much more time away from dieting for my body to truly recover. It's crazy because I never imagined it would take my body so long to recover, but obviously, especially pushing myself so far to get lean for the first time in my life as well, it's going to take my body a while to actually recover from that, and that's a big thing to learn, I think.
Yeah, I think that's something in itself. Sorry to butt in.
Okay.
I was just going to say, in terms of also the situation of going from the extreme of being in a deficit to then people that have the rush of, right, I need to start making progress immediately. So they go back to the other end of the spectrum of going, right, I've just finished prep, and then they throw the kitchen sink in off season. Yeah. And now they're immediately training really, really hard, and they're immediately using loads of volume, and they're immediately pushing their food up. And that physiological stress can be on both ends of the spectrum. So, there needs to be a little bit of time post prep where you just cruise for a little bit of time and let the body just do its thing, and then start ramping things up.
So hard to do though.
It's hard. Yeah, that's where the mindset thing is. That's where the psychological battle is.
I think that is definitely something that we did want to touch on as well, the training side of things, because we always hear people talking about whether they reverse out or whether they just pop the calories straight up to maintenance post show, but not a lot of people talk about their training. And I think a lot of people do go full throttle into their training and they absolutely obliterate themselves. So
yeah, the best analogy to use in that situation is, if you imagine if you're at peak off season, imagine you're a pilot flying a plane, and in that peak off season you're going to be at the highest altitude, and as you get closer to that prep, the plane's going to gradually come down and land. Yeah. Now it's going to basically follow the same pattern when you're coming back into your off season. So you're gradually going to take off again and start rising. Mm-hmm. And we're going to view the training stress in the same way, whether that is intensity, volume, or both. When your food is at its highest point and you're at peak off season, that's where you're going to have the maximal ability to recover and perform and adapt. And as you get closer to that, if you get closer to that prep, as you get closer to the show, obviously condition starts coming in, body fat's lower, physiological stress is higher. That's where we're going to start to go, right. The off season, we were really looking at accruing muscle mass. Mm-hmm. And now realistically, at the back end of prep, we're just looking at preserving muscle mass. Yeah. And the level of stimulus is is very different for both in terms of, if you take someone that knows how to train, they really don't need to do a lot in the gym to just preserve the amount of lean tissue they have. Okay. Which is why we can view that analogy of like, if you're going to throw the kitchen sink at it, you're only going to throw the kitchen sink at it when your physiology has the capacity to cope with that and adapt from it. And it's not in a prep, So as you get closer to that show, we're not leaving, the whole concept of like reps and reserve. It doesn't need to be anything like that. It can just be you being more calculated with what you're doing in terms of volume and, exercise selection, the amount you're doing, the amount of sets you're taking to failure, whatever it might be. And then your base is reversing that back up the other side. So as your calories start to build and as fatigue starts to wash off from the prep, we're then going gradually, we can start adding in more stimulus to the training.
Yeah. I think that was definitely one of my mistakes for my first prep. I was with a different coach to who I'm with now, but I lost a lot of muscle towards the end because I think I ended up dieting for something like 10 months in total. And I just looked like a little string bean. So, and that was because I was just going full throttle all the way through my prep. And I wasn't preserving any muscle whatsoever. I was just completely depleted. So it wasn't fun, but
yeah. I remember in my post-show phase, I had to do, I think it was like I did 1 on 1 off and I did 1 working set. And I took something like a week off as well post-show. And that was so rough. And I remember at the time thinking, I'm ready to go back into full volume now. I'm ready. But I was still, I look back now and I was still like 45 kilos and I was so dead. Like there was no way I was ready to go back. But because you've got a bit more food in you, I think a lot of females like, I'm fine, I'm ready to go. But like you're still physically not ready to take that on board. And that's a big thing to understand. And I think that when you've been in that prep for so long as well, your perception of yourself and where you're actually at that point is massively skewed. So you really can't understand what's going on, which is why it's so important to also have your coach in that post-show phase to look at you like subjectively and be able to actually pinpoint the things that need to be taken control of. Because like as an athlete yourself, like you say, when you've been through that stress mentally, I just think you can't see it yourself and you can't make the right decisions.
That's where the whole emotional attachment thing starts to become more of a hindrance sometimes than a benefit. An emotional attachment to the goal, will allow an athlete to put the work in, but it does blind you towards the back end of that process as well. And that's where the, objective nature of a coach really does start to come into its own, because the back end of prep, you can't analyze things critically and you can't analyze things without massive bias, and that poses a lot of risk.
Yeah, massively. If it's okay, I think we're in a good place to like kind of move on to the off-season, talk a little bit about off-season for females. Now there's been a few things that have been said like over social media in like the past couple of weeks, where like some pros and some pro like judges were saying a lot of things about how females shouldn't really get anywhere near 5 or 10 kilos above their stage weight in an off season, and that it's actually hindering them from a hormonal perspective to get that heavy. And I know that like myself and Hannah have both pushed up pretty high, but we're kind of interested in what your opinion is on how heavy females actually can get in an off season, and like particularly for natural females, because it's obviously sometimes some people like to say that natural females have to push it a bit harder for them to actually gain any muscle, so I'm just kind of interested in like what your opinions are on that when it comes to females, both natural and assisted.
So like I'd always use the rule of thumb that body weight in off season is irrelevant relative to the level of someone's responsiveness. So like if you can maintain your ability to respond at 10 kilos above stage weight, then that 10 kilos above stage weight just is literally irrelevant, because you're still in a position where you have a capacity to make progress. So like if we're looking at performance, recovery, fatigue management, insulin sensitivity, what's happening with digestion and the GI, if all those things are absolutely bang on, then there's no reason why you can't go to that point. Whereas if you're 10 kilos above stage weight and you've got frequent digestive complaints, your appetite's diminishing, your blood glucose is chronically high, you're inflamed, and it's like, obviously, like we shouldn't be there. That's not an effective place to be. But giving a kind of a generic statement of, you can only get 10 pounds above your stage weight and then the rest is pointless is just it's just stupid. Like that there's no like quantification of what that actually means. Like if we've got control over an athlete through an off season and we're measuring this stuff over time, then we know exactly where they are at any given moment, and we can then pull them down when we need to. But in my opinion, if we're not taking them there, then we're always leaving a little bit on the table as to what could have happened in terms of progress. Like you would have seen Erin in this last off season, like she was like 15 kilos or so, even more above her stage weight. And now she's come down and she's just, she's even more peeled than she was at 3 weeks out last time. And she's got a load more muscle, like it's do the maths. Like it's, you're going to have to take yourself to a place you've not been before. If you're going to achieve something you haven't achieved. And the whole notion of kind of 5 to 10 pounds above stage weight, it's like nothing's going to happen, especially if you're a natural. Like nothing is going to happen.
That's why I've like just been kind of giggling here and there at what Loz was saying, because I actually got 27 kilo above stage weight. But I'm 5'8", and my stage weight, I was 51 kilo, and I was literally, like I said, I was just like diminished. So before I even got into bodybuilding, my natural weight was around 71, 72. So me pushing up to 78, I still had an appetite. I was still performing really well. Like for me, getting to that point, all I cared about was my performance within the gym. And then I obviously had Cuba, like to ensure that all the other factors were looked at and to make sure that everything was kind of going the way it should be. And now I'm heading into a prep and my body is responding like so well because we took that time to like really build up. But yeah, I guess, as Loz was saying, there is going to be that little bit of difference between an assisted and a natural athlete. But yeah, what do you think then, looking at your clients in particular, like whether obviously Erin is looking absolutely incredible and she only did gain 15 kilos. And I would say
it might not have been exactly, she's probably going to listen to this, but like, it was actually this, but no, it was somewhere around that. I'll have to bring up the spreadsheet.
But yeah, she obviously, the muscle mass that she has gained as well, it's just been incredible. Whereas that may not be the same for everyone, I guess.
Yeah, like, and we've got to appreciate the fact that, the rate of gain in terms of actual lean, like contractile muscle tissue, the rate of gain for someone that's unenhanced is going to be slower, and they're probably going to need more time, off stage in the first place for that to happen. And you're probably also going to get a natural athlete who is pushing in that same manner probably has less of a tolerance to remain responsive, pushing hard, than an enhanced athlete, because that enhanced athlete is specifically using tools to improve their rate of response, so, but it's the same rule of thumb. Like I would, in that situation, and you said, right, this client, if you just completely remove the notion of scale weight in the first place, and you just look at, right, where are they visually in terms of what their check-ins look like and what their check-ins have looked like, where are they in terms of performance, recovery, fatigue, appetite, where the GI is, where blood glucose is. If all those other boxes are ticked, then the weight doesn't mean anything, because they're making progress,
Yeah.
So it's like a blank. It's a cool thing to say, right? It's one of those like those kind of soundbite things that look good to say and they look powerful, but they don't necessarily mean much in practice.
No. Because at the end of the day, the weight doesn't really mean anything in bodybuilding, like, unless you need to be concerned about weight for a specific like weight class. But when you actually look at it, like it's about how you visually look, how your body's responding, not what the weight says on the scales or how much you've gained or how much you've lost. So
like the interesting thing there is, like, if you've had an athlete who you've had in condition in the past, like you can guarantee that even if you do take them to those upper echelons, like when Erin was at her heaviest in the off season and she was like, you had that little wobble in your head, like, Jesus, am I even going to get down to where I was? Like, you're going to get there and you're going to look even better next time because your body's already been there before. If you've never been in shape before, then we do potentially need to be a little bit more conservative because you may never have competed, and we need to see where that lower set point actually is. But if you've been in shape and you stepped on stage, your body knows how to get there. It's just a case of, going through that process again.
Yeah, for sure. We did actually get a couple of questions from some people on Instagram as well that maybe you wanted to go on, or did you have anything else that you wanted to touch on for off season, Ross?
No, I think that's pretty much everything covered. The main sort of topics that I think most females would be concerned with, to be honest. So
yeah. So a couple of questions that we got. So some of them went straight in, to be honest. Mistakes from women on PEDs. So
yeah,
it doesn't have to be case studies. Like you don't.
No.
I think the main reason we want to talk about this is because a lot of our listeners are either natural or aren't sure whether they want to go assisted or not. I know obviously it depends on the goals, but it is a big decision to make as a female. Something that like me and Hannah want to know about and the listeners want to know about. So that's just why we really appreciate you talking about it.
Yeah. So in the most simplest of terms, I think the biggest consideration for female deployment is dose is one thing, duration is the next. And duration usually means the longer exposure we have to an androgen for a female, unless we're specifically dosing that in a physiological range, and you're talking like a minuscule amount for a female to bump her testosterone to say like if you looked at a Medishex panel 1.7 1.8 nanomolar, you're looking at like 3 milligrams of testosterone a week would take you to 1.7 1.8. So if we equate that to something like Anavar, for females using 5 milligrams of Anavar a day, that's we're talking 30-35 milligrams a week. So they're pushing way past that physiological range. And the more time we spend super physiological in that androgenic environment, the more risk that occurs. Okay. So one of the simplest things to look at in terms of female stat design is duration of dose and exposure is the most important aspect. We don't want to be spending long periods of time in that super physiological range. Okay. So that comes down to the nitty gritty of what we're using, the half-life of what we're using, the nature of the drug, all that stuff matters. But the thing we need to eliminate when we're looking at gender reassignment and viralization is the duration of exposure. So if you're getting a female client that coach comes in 10 weeks out, 10 milligrams of Anavar a day, why? Ask the question why. Because if the Anavar is being deployed in prep, it's only there for tissue preservation. And you might get a teeny bit of fullness from that, but it's being used to preserve tissue. At 10 weeks out, there shouldn't be a need to use something like that for that length of time. You're looking maybe, 4 weeks, short and sweet, in and out. That'll be perfect. Yeah. This is the rabbit hole, but the biggest thing is just some of the stuff you see shooting around, just the actual logical nature of what they're doing just makes no sense. It's just Chinese whispers. It's like, they do that, so I'm just going to do this as well. 12 weeks is what they said, so I'm just going to put it in for 12 weeks. We've got to have some form of calculated decision as to how you're periodizing the year in terms of your stat design and why you're using the tool in the first place. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think a lot of females are often scared to ask those questions as well.
100%.
Sometimes they just go with the coach and they tell them to take something, and especially when they don't have the knowledge, they just say, okay.
Oh my gosh. I actually had a friend where she was like, so I'm going to compete in natural federations this year. I was like, well, you can't because of what you've previously been on. And she was like, that doesn't make me not natural. I was like, okay. I think you need to just
So that'd be one thing for people listening. Like if you're with a coach and the coach is either telling you to use anabolics or enhancement, and there's no why, or there's no explanation as to this is why we're deploying it, this is what it does, these are the risk considerations, then that will be the first red flag for me. If they can't tell you why they're doing it, that's a big red flag. Okay. And that process obviously is from both parties. So it shouldn't be the coach saying you need to use this. There should be a collaboration of some sort, as in the athlete is willing to use the tool and the coach then facilitates the protocol. I think one thing to consider as well when we look at the ins and outs of this are there are lots of tools that a female can use before we even go to an androgen in the first place. So in a prep scenario, like we don't need to immediately go to anything androgenic. We could use way more tools before that even happens, even in the off season. Okay. Some of these things are a little bit more invasive because you are going to have to require yourself to either inject subcutaneously and intramuscularly. But if we get past the kind of the intricacies of that, like they're much less risk averse, and what we'd refer to as kind of like a basal stack design, where these things can be used year round for no concern. Like the androgenic side of things from a female perspective is the thing we need to be really concerned about, and especially for long periods of time. Okay.
Yeah.
Dose is one thing, duration is another, but there are plenty of tools that we can deploy across the year that aren't going to equate to the same amount of risk, that still stimulate similar pathways, which are going to cause the same similar response. So like growth hormone would be a great one, injectable L-carnitine. Like females using Clen and PrEP, like Clen is going to have the tissue preservative benefits in a calorie deficit. So we can use that as a tool. We could use an ARB. There are things that we can use here and deploy that are not androgenic that will be the first point of call. And this is an interesting thing because like I've had this before where you go through a process and there might be 3 or 4 tools that I'd put in a female client stack who is enhanced. And because they see 4 things on paper versus 10 milligrams of Anavar, they freak out. But we need to understand what they actually mean in terms of like, what are these 4 things doing, or what's the Anavar doing? Because the Anavar is the one that we actually want to be concerned about, because this is one that's going to have the biggest bang for its buck. Yeah. Whereas if we said, right, 1 IU of growth hormone, 200 milligrams of injectable L-carnitine and something else, I can keep you on that year round and nothing is going to happen to your blood work. If you take Anavar for a year, you're going to turn into a bloke. This is the consideration that we need to take into account. But like, without making this like a drug conversation, I'd just say for anyone listening, like if you're in a position where this is either being forced on you or it's coming up in conversation, if the individual telling you can't explain why and what these things do and the safety considerations and what happens when we stop taking them and how are we going to pick up the pieces after, are we looking at blood work? Are we not looking at blood work? Those are the things that we need to really take into account.
Yeah. That was really good.
Yeah, that was really interesting. I guess as well, mixing into that, I know we've only got 5 minutes left on this, so but a lot of people were asking about birth control and kind of what your opinion on that is, and whether taking it out will like massively affect their progress within the gym, or whether you think it doesn't have any effect at all.
So the first thing to consider is, if it's going to be deployed, I wouldn't deploy it at a time where having a really specific, strict control of composition is the goal. So in a prep scenario, it would not be a good time to deploy hormonal birth control when we're in a contest prep. If we're going to do it, we'd be wanting to do that in the off season, because we've got a long stretch of time that we can analyze how your body's responding to that, whatever milligram per week you're using, whether it's combined, whether it's whatever it is. Kind of bigger considerations ethically as a coach, we can't tell a female client not to use something. We can just make them aware of what that.
Just don't have sex.
Yeah. Just use a condom. That we can make them aware of the potential implications. The biggest thing for body composition, generally speaking, progesterone-based birth control is going to cause the biggest potential curveball in the predictability of the response in terms of body composition, and it is going to have impacts on female circulating androgens. So if we're getting a suppression of that androgen receptor from birth control, and we're seeing that testosterone start to diminish on female blood work, then we are doing ourselves a little bit of a disservice here if we are a physique-based athlete who's looking to build tissue over time. That will be my main concern over birth control, okay? Does it mean that you're not going to be able to get in shape? No, because we've all seen people using birth control who still get peeled. Does it mean that you're potentially leaving a little bit on the table in terms of muscle growth, particularly if we're using exogenous progesterone? Absolutely, we can't deny that. But I think, this is a conversation that I've had a lot of chats about with other people. Like, we can't be in a position where, it's our decision as a coach. We've just got to make that individual aware of what they're doing and why they're doing it. And if they've got a legitimate reason, and sometimes like this might be, female clients using birth control to,
like
they might
acne,
have
or like
acne, skin health, it's having an impact on their quality of life. And it's not my role to then say, well, you need to come off that because you're going to grow more muscle if you can. If you can't come off it, because she's having that for a significant reason in her life. These are the things that we've got to take into account.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, perfect. I mean, I think, like I said, we didn't have long left. So I guess we just want to say thank you for having you on.
Yeah, we really appreciate you taking the time to come on, and it's just like sharing that information. That's obviously what we want to do with the podcast, is just kind of get that information out to females, because it is lost a lot of the time. And like you say, with so many things, it's just making people aware, and then people have the decision, like they can make their own choices once they know all the information. But sometimes lack of information like really holds a lot of people back from making the right choices for them. So yeah, we really appreciate you coming on and giving us the time today. It's been awesome.
And on that note as well, because you are a bit of a fountain of knowledge, where can people find you and find all this information?
Sure.
I know you've got the portal.
Yeah. I'm on a less than a minute, so I'll make this quick. If you type in the Muscle Mentors on Instagram, you'll find all of our Instagram bios, like me, Luke, Ryan, Alex, Paul, James, Ross, and then again, Muscle Mentors into Google. It'll bring up the portal with the education website, which all of the stuff is on. So all the content that we've just spoken about today is on there. There's a YouTube, there's a podcast. So yeah, if you're interested, just type in the Muscle Mentors and you'll be able to find something.
Well, before we run out of time, we just want to say a big thank you to everyone for listening, and we'll be back again next week with another episode.